Now, the rest of the story. Neither Eli nor Mortimer said a word as they drove past the city limits and out toward the dark woods outside town. And when they found a secluded spot, both of them got out of the car. Eli stared into Mortimer's eyes. He said, "I don't want it to end this way, but I can't take care of you anymore. I can barely feed myself." Obvious as it ought to have been, now for the first time, Mortimer appeared to realize that something was terribly wrong. He looked around him and then up into the looming tree branches and then back into the face of the man who'd found him orphaned and hungry and then fed him and loved him. And both were quiet for a minute or two as the bittersweet memories chased after one another, leading back to the day that they'd first met, Eli, the failing businessman, and Mortimer, the mouse? The mouse? The mouse. But this is the rest of the story. Advertising's a tough, competitive industry to begin with, especially if you're not cut out for it, and Eli had just about decided he was not cut out for it. Then one day, this stranger wandered into his shabby office, a little gray field mouse, who, with a boldness atypical of his kind, clambered up and onto the desk where Eli was working. Eli had been nursing a cheese sandwich most of the afternoon. He could spare a little, he supposed, so he pinched a tiny hunk of cheddar between his fingers, and he held up. "Come on, fella," he told the mouse. "You gotta work for it." And what do you know? The tiny creature, cautiously at first, leaned forward, sniffed the air excitedly, and then inch by inch, courageously drew nearer the cheese until he was close enough to snatch it from Eli's grasp. The ad man laughed aloud. His little visitor was so tame, might it have been somebody's pet? If not, he was now. And for each day thereafter, the mouse ventured forth from a crack in the wall, climbed up onto Eli's desk for a bite of cheese, became so trusting as time went on that he often curled up in the palm of Eli's hand and went to sleep. And then after a while, the mouse, whom Eli named Mortimer, would wake up and scamper away. For Eli, the hard times grew harder. Things were flopping, that he could no longer even afford the cheese sandwich that had sustained him until his supper of cold beans. And yet there, disheveled and discouraged and on the brink of bankruptcy, his first concern was for Mortimer. For there was a restaurant downstairs, a restaurant whose owner baited his mousetraps with the same cheese that Eli could no longer afford to share. And that's when Eli decided to take Mortimer out into the woods on the edge of town. "I want you to be careful out there," he told the little fellow. And Mortimer was gone. But once upon a remarkable encounter in 1923, there was a commercial artist in Kansas City too soft-hearted for the aggressive world of advertising. But now whenever you reflect on the subsequent success of Eli, Walter Elias Disney, I hope you'll remember in your mind a tiny creature sleeping in his hand, whom Walt Disney one day would immortalize under the name his wife preferred, Mickey Mouse. Because now, after all, now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Mickey Mouse. It was as if he always existed. It's hard to imagine a world before that little mouse. But the creation of Mickey Mouse began with another cartoon character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Remember him? Most people don't. In 1927, Charles Mintz, who was Walt's film producer and a distributor for Universal Pictures, learned that Universal wanted to get into the cartoon business, as other film studios had done with much success. At the time, all films were silent. A piano player often accompanied films. Cartoons were also silent, and they were played before the feature film, like the opening act at a concert. Walt Disney Studios was just finishing up on 2 cartoon projects, Alice Comedies and Julius the Cat. Since there were numerous cat characters in leading cartoon roles, like Crazy Cat, Felix the Cat, Julius the Cat, Charles suggested Walt focus on a rabbit. Walt and his chief animator, Ub Iwerks, created Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And on March 4th, 1927, Walt Disney signed a contract to produce 26 Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoon shorts. Walt and Ub's first Oswald cartoon was called Poor Papa, but Universal hated it. They rejected it completely. They said the production quality was poor and Oswald looked old and sloppy. Walt and Ub went back to the drawing board. They knew that they had to work harder this time around to impress Universal. They reworked Oswald's character into a younger, neater rabbit and produced a second cartoon called Trolley Troubles. Universal loved this version and officially launched Oswald on September the 5th, 1927. Based on production costs and sales revenue, Oswald turned out to be Universal's greatest success up to that time. Walt and his brother Roy earned $500 per Oswald short. Adjusted for inflation, that would be just over $9,000 in today's money. And they had a contract for 26 cartoons. But then Walt began to worry. His producer, Charles Mintz, the one who suggested the rabbit cartoon character, was using a middleman to lure Disney animators away. What was Charles planning? Was he trying to create his own animation studio? But the big question, well, to Walt anyway, was would Charles renew Disney's contract with Universal? In February 1928, Walt and his wife Lillian traveled by train from Hollywood, California to Manhattan, New York to negotiate a new contract. With the success of the 26 Oswald cartoons, Walt hoped for a more profitable contract. But Charles Mintz had other ideas. He wanted Walt to take a 20% cut. Walt refused the pay cut and learned that Universal owned all rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Walt could no longer create Oswald cartoons. Charles Mintz opened his own studio known as Screen Gems, which consisted mostly of former Disney employees. Charles Mintz's studio began producing Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons. Walt was right. Just before Walt left New York for the cross-country train ride back to Hollywood, he sent his brother Roy a telegram. Rather than giving him the bad news, Walt's message said, "Don't worry, everything okay." But everything was not okay, and both Walt and Roy knew it. They needed a new lead character fast. In 1948, Walt remembered, "He popped out of my mind onto a drawing pad 20 years ago on a train ride from Manhattan to Hollywood at a time when the business fortunes of my brother Roy and myself were at lowest ebb and disaster seemed right around the corner." Walt named the new character not Mickey Mouse, Mortimer Mouse. Walt's daughter Diane Disney Miller recalled, "It was on that long train ride that Dad conceived of a new cartoon subject, a mouse who was then refined and further developed by Iwerks and given his name by my mother." Walt and Ub completed the first Mickey Mouse cartoon in May 1928. The silent black and white cartoon was inspired by Charles Lindbergh's first solo flight across the Atlantic and called Plane Crazy. In Plane Crazy, Mickey Mouse and other animal friends attempted to assemble and fly their own airplane. Walt showed the film on May 15, 1928 at a test screening for distributors. No one was interested. No one. A second Mickey Mouse cartoon, this one called Galloping Gaucho, also failed to interest distributors. Unless something changed, Walt Disney Studios would go bankrupt. And that would be it. Walt, his brother Roy, Iwerks, and the few employees who remained began working on something that had never been done before. A cartoon with sound. Now, The Jazz Singer, the first film to utilize synchronized sound, had been released just a few months earlier. Finally, the third Mickey Mouse cartoon short was finished, and it was called Steamboat Willie. It was the very first cartoon in history with synchronized sound. It premiered on November the 18th, 1928, and overshadowed the feature film it was meant to complement. It was a sensation. Walt Studio received $1,000 for a 2-week run. Man, That would be about $18,500 in today's money. And that was just one theater. It showed all over the country. According to WaltDisney.org, it was the highest sum ever paid for a cartoon on Broadway. This 7 minutes, 47-second cartoon saved Walt Disney Studios, and a star was born. Now, throughout the years, Mickey Mouse has evolved to reflect the cultural values of the times. This has kept Mickey Mouse from feeling dated and old. His character always seems fresh. Mickey Mouse is known throughout the world as being optimistic, brave, and lovable. Imagine for a moment that Walt had gotten on that train in New York City bound for Hollywood and sank into self-pity. The name Walt Disney probably wouldn't even be recognizable to us today. We wouldn't have grown up watching all of those films that we cherished as children and still cherish today. Fantasia, Snow White, The Jungle Book, Peter Pan, The Lion King, Little Mermaid, and so many more. We wouldn't have Disney theme parks or Cinderella's castle. Despite everything seemingly being against him, Walt Disney didn't give up. That train ride was the most important train ride of Walt Disney's life, and we have all benefited from it. And as Walt Disney pointed out, it was all started by a mouse. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.